Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I think we will get started, and thank you for being here this afternoon. So, my name is Russ Gannum, and I am Associate Provost and Dean of International Programs at the University of Iowa. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Bernie Barola, Vice President of the Office for International Community and Economic Engagement at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. We are honored to welcome Bernie as the 9th speaker in International Programs' Commitment to Internationalization Lecture Series. The Commitment to Internationalization Lecture is delivered every year during International Education Week. It represents the culmination of a week-long set of activities designed to showcase the many facets of Iowa's global engagement. Today's presentation, entitled Combating Nationalism, Why the World Needs More Internationalization, argues that despite the emergence of an increasingly interconnected world, growing nationalistic movements are gaining ground across the globe. Bernie's talk will explore how we got here and why the world needs greater engagement and integration, not less. Bernie Barola joined APLU in February 2020, certainly an inauspicious time to begin a new job. He provides leadership, to the APLU Office of International Programs and the APLU Commission on International Initiatives. In addition, Bernie is responsible for strengthening the global engagement and impact of member universities in the US, Canada, and Mexico. Under the Obama administration, Bernie led a 5-year bilateral presidential initiative to increase higher education partnerships, research collaboration, and student exchange among U.S. and Indonesian universities. It was this exchange that occasioned Bernie's first visit to the University of Iowa in 2017. He was also involved with the Office of Global and Educational Programs at the U.S. Department of State to promote U.S. higher education abroad and increase the number of international students studying at American universities. Earlier in his career, Bernie worked in college admissions at Claremont McKenna College in California and served on the admissions committee at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He is also an application reviewer for the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University in China, and we actually have had some applicants from the University of Iowa come through. Bernie earned his master's degree in development economics from the Fletcher School at Tufts and his bachelor's degree in international relations from Claremont McKenna College. He is a former Peace Corps volunteer in Cape Verde, West Africa. Is that how you pronounce it? Okay. And is fluent in Spanish and Portuguese. Active on Capitol Hill, Bernie testified before the U.S. Senate Judicial Subcommittee on Immigration, Citizenship, and Border Safety this past June. The video is available on the U.S. Senate website if you are interested. Bernie testified on behalf of public universities, discussing the importance of international student and undocumented student contributions to our university's society and economy. Before we begin, please let me express my thanks to the Stanley University of Iowa Foundation Support Organization for making this lecture series possible. In addition, warm gratitude goes to our communications and relations team, Amy Brewster, Sue Shannon, Ben Partridge, and Amy Green, with special applause going to Katie Ron, a former classmate of Bernie's at Tufts, for suggesting Bernie as a speaker, and to Dan Vorwerk for his handling of all the logistics associated with Bernie's visit. And of course, we want to thank you, the audience, for being here today. Bernie will speak for 45 to 60 minutes, followed by Q&A. And as a final note, please let me say how much fun it has been to get to know Bernie these past few days. And of course, we would like to thank him for meeting with so many of our constituents this week in an effort to advocate for internationalization and Iowa's global mission. And with that, I'll hand things over to our friend Bernie Barola.
Thank you, Russ. Does that work? Can you hear me? Okay. I never know how these microphones, if they work properly or not, but okay. Last bit of technology here. And I think we are set. Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. and again for inviting me to come speak at the University of Iowa. It's always a pleasure, International Education Week, to be able to come to one of our member institutions and meet with staff, with students, with faculty members, and understand better what is happening on the campus so that we can be better informed back in Washington and represent the universities to Congress and to federal agencies. I'm going to jump right into this presentation. I originally had a bit more of an intro, but I want to jump right in because I'm afraid I have between 60 to 65 minutes of a presentation here. So let's not waste any time and see if this works. Not sure what I did wrong there. Well, you know, I wasn't sure what the audience would be like, if it was going to be primarily undergrad, grad students, faculty. So I realized this is going to be a bit more geared to that undergrad, grad population, but I'll wing it as I go, looking at seeing how many faculty and staff members there are. But let me begin by just saying that we're living in a very unique time in our history, where essentially all facets of our lives are touched by globalization. Whether it's, you know, the shoes that you're wearing, whether they are American brands like Nike or New Balance, they're most likely not made in the US, or you're wearing Adidas, which is a German shoe company, or Reebok, which is a British shoe company, but again, manufactured most likely in China or India or Vietnam. And the phone that you have in your pocket, assuming it's an iPhone, is most likely designed here in the US and California, but of course manufactured in China. If you have an Android, it's likely designed in Korea, but made in India or Vietnam. And if you're one of the few that have a Google Pixel, it's probably also designed in California, but manufactured in China. And if you're on your phone, you probably have apps. Those apps are also most likely not always going to be American. The most famous of which is TikTok, which is actually a Chinese app. But for the one Gen Z person that might be here, you might also know Be Real, which is, or maybe Gen X, not sure. Millennial, sorry. You might also know Be Real, which is an app that's becoming quite popular now, which is actually a French-based app. And even beyond just the apps on our phones itself, even the food that we eat. We're here in Iowa, which is a huge food producer, but in the winter months, which it's looking like we're in at the moment, most of that produce that you're going to find in supermarkets is likely grown in other countries like Peru or Mexico, New Zealand, or Chile. So even that food that we're eating and consuming is from abroad. And where you buy that food might also not necessarily be American. One of the most iconic supermarkets, at least where I live, and I know there's one here in Iowa City, is Trader Joe's. This is not an American-owned company. This is actually a German-owned company that owns Trader Joe's. It's the same parent company that owns Aldi, which I think there's also an Aldi here in Iowa City. So again, we are incredibly interconnected to a global economy, from what we wear, what we eat, what we listen to, what we watch, and where we even buy our groceries locally. All have, you know, all touch on a globalized system and economy. So that is my first point, is that we are incredibly interconnected. And especially the current generation here at university is probably more connected to global culture than any generation previously. They are exposed to international influencers on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, and almost every movie or Netflix series that you watch nowadays has images, scenes in Shanghai, in Dubai, in Cairo, in Paris, in addition to cities here in the United States. As a Gen Xer, I remember when I was growing up in the 80s, everything was local. Everything maybe was in New York or LA, maybe every now and then you'd get a Montreal or Vancouver shot, but rarely would you see the base of the themes in foreign countries on a regular basis in television and in movies. And as we've become greater and more interconnected, one of the things that's been kind of interesting is that we've also become more prosperous and safe as a society over the last 50 years as we've seen this integration and globalization happen. Now, that's not always obvious to people, so I'm going to kind of put this in our face right now, what I mean by this. If you look at this graph, this shows the last 600 years, essentially, of violence from war. And you can see, if you draw a line here, we are at a pretty low point historically in terms of deaths by conflict. If you look back, especially this period in the 1500s, now we all know a lot was happening in the 1500s. You have the Spanish conquest of the Americas. You have slavery in this period. So there was traumatic death in that particular period. But we're within a 600-year period, and at a pretty low period in terms of violent death that humans experience from war and conflict. Of course, going back 600 years is probably a little unfair. Let's look a little bit closer, and we can look at the period just since World War II. And again, you will see that just since World War II in the 1940s, we have seen again a dramatic decrease in violence from war and conflict. And for many of us in this lifetime period, at least the last 20 years, you can see it's at a particularly low point in terms of violence and conflict. We can also see that life expectancy has increased in the last 50 years. Across the board, if you look at every continent, Africa, Asia, Americas, Oceania, and at the world levels, you can see something quite dramatic happen somewhere around 1950. And you see this massive increase in lifespans. What is it that's causing this change in these last 50 years of decreased violence, increased livelihoods, and greater safety and prosperity in the world? Well, I would posit it is globalization. It is internationalization that has caused much of this wealth, prosperity, and relative safety in terms of global conflicts. In the post-war period, we have developed international institutions like the World Bank, the United Nations, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, that have enacted policies and procedures that allow for greater stability and security in the world. And if you're skeptical about these laws and global treaties, you can look at it at a micro level back here in the States. We have rules, regulations, laws that we've built for the last 200 years here in the US, which allow you when you go, say, to the supermarket or you go to the gas station and you pump gas, you know that thanks to regulations and laws, that gas you're pumping in your car is 100% gas. It's not a mixture of 60% gas, 40% water. You know that the pump is putting in the 5 or 10 or 15 gallons that it says it's putting in on that tank. And that's because we trust these regulations and rules that we have put in place over the years to protect us. The same is true at global level. So as we put in these global policies, treaties, and agreements, this helps provide some stability, some rules, and an ability to have lower costs of transactions between nations, allowing us to trade more freely, to travel more freely, and to invest and share in research enterprise more freely. Now, since World War II, countries have largely agreed to this international framework, this set of international laws, norms, and regulations that have made it much easier for this globalization to take place and for greater stability within the world. And we've reaped many benefits from that. In the last 70 years, thanks to globalization, research has accelerated at unprecedented pace. Scientists, academics, and researchers share their knowledge globally. They publish in internationally peer-reviewed journals, and they allow this research then to be built upon, not just in the country where it begins, but from other countries that can add to that research. And this international research collaboration has been critical in advancing innovative technology, science, and medicine. And it does not occur in a vacuum. It is the result of people tinkering, sharing ideas, and getting capital from global markets to move the innovation to market. Most technologies today were not invented by a single person, despite what Elon Musk may want you to believe, but rather from years of research, years of trial and error from inventors and scientists the world over. These are just some examples of how globalization has benefited all of us in terms of providing greater access to goods and services. Our lives would be immeasurably poorer if global trade halted today. We experienced this to an extent during the global pandemic when we suddenly saw shelves in markets that were empty because global trade had slowed. And so we do have a bit of an experience of what this would be like if we halted global trade in its entirety. Also, things that we use on a daily basis, your phone, those rare minerals that are in your cell phone, in your electric car, in your computer, are mined in Africa, but refined in China. If we did not have access to that, we would not have the cell phones and the technology that we enjoy on a daily basis. And while farm to fork is a great concept, I personally love it, there's no way we would be able to feed the entire world's population just eating locally. We rely on global trade and agricultural products. We can see how this is working, for example, currently in the war with Ukraine, with wheat shortages that are negatively impacting food security in the Middle East and in Africa. So I posit that globalization has improved livelihoods, not only through these lower costs, but also through medical and technological advancements that are allowing people to live longer. And we've seen also an improvement in our ability to have capacity of institutions, global institutions. Trade, international research, and global competition result in the need for greater capacity of global systems to handle the functioning of the global marketplace. You can look at Europe and EU regulations as a standard of where people are trying to move. You can see how the World Health Organization has been pivotal in developing identification ways to identify communicable diseases like Ebola, as well as COVID, and being able to predict where those might land. And it's also increased, globalization has also increased our global knowledge and understanding of different cultures and people and languages. The more we trade, travel, and get to know one another, the more we get to understand one another and appreciate both our own cultures and those of others. Now, usually at this point, it sounds like I'm being a bit Pollyannish, that obviously I'm only seeing the positive impacts of globalization. There we are. That it may seem like I'm looking through rose-colored glasses at the world and not understanding that many troubles and trials still exist in this planet. Of course, we still have the war in Ukraine. We still have the recent wars that took place in Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen. There are still the impacts from climate change. You could easily argue that globalization has not helped this, but hurt this. And we still have, at least in this country, an increase in gun violence and crime. There's still human trafficking and forced migration. And of course, the ever-persistent issue of domestic violence. So it's not perfect, but we have seen improved livelihoods over the last 50 years. And one thing we don't talk about as much, which is kind of strange, is terrorism. Still something that impacts us, although it's definitely seems to be removed from the conversation, at least in the news cycle, over the last 5 or 10 years. And the reality is, unlike my particular generation, I'm a Gen Xer, I grew up in a period of relative improvement. We saw the world getting smaller, we saw livelihoods improving, we saw global systems getting in place, the euro being adopted, for example, whereas the generation currently at university has had a very different reality. They have seen a world in decline, one in which financial systems seem insecure, housing systems are unstable, one where climate change is creating bigger issues for them to deal with, and living standards relative to previous periods have been decreasing. So these are some differences that we might not always recognize between different generations, our perception of how the world is going. I can stand here and think about how much better life has been in the last 50 years, but that might seem quite different to someone in their 20s at university at the moment. I realize also that we're living in the present, and we don't really think about things from 20, 30, 40 years ago. Instead, we're looking at how is life today. And I put forth to you that we are at an inflection point at the moment, where there are greater challenges than ever to our democracies and our way of living and enjoying the global benefits that we've had for the last 50 years. Nationalism, authoritarianism is threatening many of the benefits that we've achieved over the last 50 years. Now, why do I believe this? Well, if you look at the last 15 years in particular, there's some pretty discouraging information. Last year, the Freedom House issued a report, and this graph illustrates the decline that we're seeing in democracies. Now, to understand this graph, it takes the number of countries where democratic institutions are improving and then subtracts the number of countries where democratic institutions are declining. So a negative number is not a good thing. A negative number means that more countries are backsliding on democracy than moving forward with democratic institutions. And today, only about 20% of the world currently resides in a free democracy. That's the lowest level it's been since 1995. Now, what does it look like for a country to slide back on democracy? Well, I'm going to show you 7 steps, although you could easily point to 15 or 20, but 7 steps of where nationalist movements tend to lead a country that is democratic. The first, nationalist movements tend to weaponize fear. Instead of playing on people's best values and creating policies to improve lives, nationalist movements prey on our worst fears. The fear of change, the fear of the unknown, the fear of people who don't look like them, who don't sound like them, the fear of loss, be it economic loss, cultural loss, or loss of agency and power. Second part of the playbook on how you get to nationalism. You undermine institutions. This can be questioning elections, questioning the judicial system, questioning systems and institutions that have existed for quite some time, but are being viewed as out of touch, in need of reform, or no longer relevant. 3, you exploit religion. Using religion to justify the nationalist movements is a common theme and step that we see. You connect religion to the state, and therefore you make the movement unquestionable. How do you question a nationalist movement when it now seems to be doing the Lord's work? 4, you target outsiders. This is going to be key in order to gain support within your country. You obviously can't attack the majority culture within the society. You're going to need that group to support your movement. So you go after minorities, you go after LGBTQ+ communities, ethnic minorities, so on and so forth. 5, you rewrite history. You promise a return to some golden era that likely never existed and is not based on any reality. And you create a mythology around the leader of your nationalist movement. 6, you divide and conquer. You promote violence against those that don't follow your regime. This is the you're with us or you're against us mentality. And this violence is often against religious groups, ethnic groups, and in many places, the highly educated. And finally, you erode truth. Think fake news, alternative facts. You make it difficult to know what is real, what is not, what is fact, what is fiction. These 7 steps, and again, you could break these into even more steps if you wanted to, but this is a general playbook. Now, they don't always fall in this order, and not all countries tick off every single one of these, but these are the first signs that your democracy is going in the wrong direction. It's backsliding. Now, many leaders, many movements have won elections by questioning the value of globalization and running on these nationalist platforms. That is, choose anything international. We saw this here in the US under the previous administration, where the US pulled out of the Paris Agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and cut funding and support for the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and even questioned the relevance of NATO. And it's not only in the US that this has happened. You can think of the UK, in Britain, where Brexit took place, where you saw a movement about removing foreign influence from Brussels and returning the UK to the British people. In Hungary, you have Viktor Orban, who has increasingly questioned the value of the European Union and has taken a hard stance on immigration and against globalization. And most obvious, in Russia, you have Putin, who is trying to currently at this moment undermine global institutions and keep other countries from joining global alliances. And of course, considers the Western order to be a threat. And he too, Putin, has followed this nationalist playbook. You can almost check off every one of these in what you've seen in Russia in the last 20 years. Narrow defining what it means to be a Russian, and then making anyone who doesn't fit that model the enemy. He has attacked the LGBTQ+ community and anyone that appears to be too pro-Western. And we have seen an embrace in religion and the use of religious iconography and symbolism to legitimize his own regime. And with the complete nationalization of the media, he has made it possible to erode truth and objectivity, making it incredibly difficult for the average Russian to understand what is happening in their own name. So my point here is, if you're a critical thinker, if you have some perspective, it can be very obvious to see these signs of nationalism. Nationalist movements are not particularly creative in how they go about overtaking democratic institutions, but they can be highly effective when they tie nationalism with patriotism. And this is where things get blurry, as many can confuse nationalism and patriotism. So what is the difference between these two terms? Well, here's the definition by Britannica of nationalism. You can see here it's an ideology. That's the first thing to keep in mind. It's an ideology that emphasizes loyalty, devotion, or allegiance to a nation or nation state, and holds that such obligations outweigh other individual or group interests. Now let's see what the definition of patriotism is. It's love that people feel for their country. It is not an ideology, it's an emotion. Two very different things, nationalism and patriotism. And I like an even better definition than either of these, which is from the journalist Sidney Harris from the Chicago Sun-Times. He was in the 20th century, a journalist of the Chicago Sun-Times. And he, I think, quite easily defined the two as the difference between patriotism and nationalism is that the patriot is proud of his country for what it does, and the nationalist is proud of his country no matter what it does. And to me, that's the clearest example of the difference between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is a positive thing, but can be perverted and used to support nationalism. And when you have enough people buy into nationalism, that is when democracy and democratic institutions are in threat. So where does this lead us? Well, I'm afraid to say that nationalism does not lead us to a very positive outcome. In fact, it leads us to a very, very dark place. We can look at modern history, at nationalist movements, and where they have led. From Nazi Germany to the authoritarianism of Stalinist Russia, Pinochet's Chile, Imperial Japan, the Cultural Revolution under Chairman Mao, Cambodia's genocide under Pol Pot, and so on and so forth. The list goes on, but all of these regimes have ended in violence and the death of too many people. Now, these atrocities don't happen overnight, and often societies don't realize that they will happen until it is too late. Recall, nationalism is the ideology that requires allegiance to the state above all else. So once in place, it becomes very difficult to combat nationalism. And when that allegiance is transferred from the state to the leader, you're in for a really bad time. Now, some may argue that a strong leader that advocates for their country, their people, above all other things can be a good thing. Even the role of a leader, to place loyalty of their country above all others. And you can look at autocratic leaders sometimes in nationalist movements and admire how they get things done, because they get things done. Be it infrastructure projects, enacting national policies, or simply making the trains run on time. By comparison, democracies can seem clunky and inefficient. One could point to our own democratic institutions and realize how difficult it is to get anything done in Congress. And after last week's elections, I can promise you even less will get done over the next 2 years. So when people see their government systems not functioning and are worried about their future, about their own personal wealth, health, and security, and you see a leader willing to make progress in ways the current system cannot, why wouldn't you embrace nationalism? We are by nature tribal. Our instincts are familiar. We seek out those that think like us, look like us, talk like us. And once we have found that nationalist leader, we're often willing to look past their faults, just the way we do our sports teams. Whether our teams are winning or losing, we support our sports teams. They're our team. They're our autocrat. But when nationalism, especially when imbued with patriotism, takes hold, it can be very difficult to undo. Unlike democratic elections, you can't vote out an autocrat. Now, the beauty of democracy, as imperfect and as slow as it might be at times, is at its core, it's a governing system where the power is derived from the people and not from the leader. And democracy has institutions to check power, to protect the rights of citizens, and to make it more difficult to divide people. Which is why history has shown that if nationalism takes root, it does not take long for democracy to fail. So why are we seeing this rise in nationalism today? I think the answer to that, ironically, is due to globalism. Globalism has brought rapid change that can make people uneasy, afraid, and threatened. We've witnessed major changes due to culture, demographics, values, language, and even what once people felt were well-established ideas like sexuality and gender have been questioned as we have become more connected globally. We have Well, I would just say, let's face it, people generally don't like change, especially when they feel that change is forced upon them. And globalization has created a lot of change. I started this by talking about all the benefits of globalization. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't explain that there's also some negative attributes to globalization. While it's increased living standards, it's led to greater technological and scientific breakthroughs, and it's created stronger institutions, it hasn't always spread that wealth and those benefits out equitably. We know that there have been winners and there have been losers. And when you're on the losing end of globalism, think much of the Rust Belt manufacturing sector in this country or rural areas, when you're on the losing side of that globalization, it doesn't matter if the country in general has gotten better, if for things for you, your family, your neighbors, your community have gotten worse. Add to that the increased influence from foreign cultures and ways of living that can be viewed as a challenge or even a threat to traditional societal norms. People feel threatened by rapid change that they see happening around them. And we know that our demographics in this country are changing, that the world's cultures and people are coming into closer contact with one another. And these are changes that people see and feel in their daily lives. Has much more impact than the benefits that we achieve from a trade deal that might suddenly protect intellectual property rights for a tech company. The perception, whether real or not, that globalization can be a threat to daily life is an easy message for politicians to use. Messages like, those countries are taking your jobs, immigrants are causing crime, changing your culture, and getting ahead at the expense of real Americans. The woke culture has run amok. What I'm saying probably sounds a little familiar. We all have family members who have probably expressed these concerns. Some of us may have these concerns, and these concerns are legitimate. People's insecurities, concerns, and feelings are real. Big changes to our society are happening. Cultures are merging, immigration is on the rise, crime is up in many parts of our country, inflation is up, and the existential threat of climate change and war is more on the minds than ever before. The current moment is ripe for nationalism. So where do we go from here? How do we handle that change while still benefiting from globalization? Well, first off, the one constant that we always hear, that the only constant is change, is going to continue. We're never going to change change. We know that there's never been a movement in history that has ever stopped change in its tracks. So we're going to have to live with this change. But how we address this change is critical. We know that following the path of fear, of authoritarianism, leads to a dangerous place. No society that has followed that path has liked the outcome. So the other option is strengthening our democratic institutions, our civility, and recognizing the positive attributes that come from change and seeking out policies to address the negative aspects of globalization. And this is where universities, and I think in particular public universities, can play a major role. I just like this cartoon. I'm just concerned that if we embrace change this one time, change might get the wrong idea and mistake it for some kind of long-term commitment. I think it perfectly encapsulates this idea that somehow we think we can stop change. In regards to the role that universities can play in strengthening our democracies, let me start with three key quotes. First is by Winston Churchill. He says, the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. He always has a way with words. Another is by a Republican politician and U.S. District Court, Charles Pickering, who says, a healthy democracy requires a decent society. It requires that we are honorable, generous, tolerant, and respectful. And the last is by FDR, who said, democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. The real safeguard of democracy, therefore, is education. As you can see from these quotes, democracies function better with a more educated population and one that is more respectful and tolerant. Now, I hate the word tolerant, so I'm going to just substitute curious and respectful to others instead of tolerant, but it's the same kind of idea. And I believe public universities can play an even larger role beyond just education to help strengthen our democracies. So I'll give you three areas that I think we can be useful. Here we are. The first is education and critical thinking. We live in a period, in a time of mass communications, of misinformation, of disinformation. It's imperative that we educate people to be critical thinkers, well-rounded in the liberal arts and sciences, and able to identify fact from fiction. Universities can teach students these critical skills around intercultural communication, understanding of different cultures, religions, and values. But education is not going to be enough. Democracies are also strengthened by having a healthy and vibrant middle class. This is an area where we're uniquely positioned. Universities are key drivers of the economy. The research and innovation that comes from universities helps create new businesses, new inventions, and greater scientific discoveries that benefit everyone. And universities are uniquely capable of developing the high-skilled workforce that will drive future innovation and business development. But of course, not everyone is going to graduate and become a Nobel physicist or the doctor that cures cancer. We often forget that universities are the pathway, and have historically always been the pathway for people to achieve the middle class in the United States. And we've done this for generations, producing teachers, healthcare professionals, accountants, business leaders. After World War II, we saw the GI Bill expand the middle class and expand access to higher education like never before. And while we know the GI Bill was not perfect, many Black and Latino Americans were excluded from accessing many of the benefits of the GI Bill, it still had a profound impact on building a middle class and turbocharging the economy of the 20th century. Third, universities expose students to new ideas, cultures, and values. Universities bring together a broad and diverse student body and expose those students to new ideas, cultures, and ways of thinking. In other words, it helps us get past our natural tribalism and be more comfortable with discomfort. We know that at a university, you encounter people from diverse and different backgrounds who may challenge your own views and outlook. And if you haven't experienced this, I challenge you to go ahead and meet some students that think differently from you, because trust me, in life, it will help you tremendously to be comfortable with interacting with people from different backgrounds and different viewpoints. We live in a multi-plural society where it's critical that we understand and value the differences and contributions various groups make to society. It also makes it harder for leaders to divide us. Now, when I began this presentation, I stated that I would be making the case for how internationalization helps us combat nationalism. And it might seem that I'm doing quite the opposite, that I'm instead blaming globalism and internationalism for many of the reasons why we're seeing a rise in nationalism. Well, this is the great irony of globalization. It can be both the cause of and the answer to nationalism. So let me make the case for internationalization. Despite this rise in nationalism, the world will continue to be more integrated and get smaller. The problems of the world will only be solved through greater global collaboration. The reality is that the biggest challenges that we face today are ones that require a global response. We can't deal with the impacts of climate change, pandemics, and food insecurity without global cooperation. And it will be increasingly challenging to solve political disputes without better understanding each other's values, perspectives, cultures, and histories. I posit that we have two paths in front of us when dealing with the reality of the future of globalization. The first is the path of resistance, of refusing to recognize the benefits of a more interconnected, multicultural world, and instead focusing on the negatives and those things that divide us. This is a very dark path that leads us toward nationalism and authoritarianism. Recall the images from January 6th at the US Capitol. This is the path we don't want to follow. The second path is one where we embrace the benefits of globalization while at the same time strengthening our democratic systems to safeguard and make the differences in globalization between winners and losers smaller. Stronger institutions can create policies, regulations, and actions needed to share the benefits more equitably from globalization. But there are several things this path will require. It will require a government that is pressured by the electorate to act in meaningful ways to improve lives, not to fight culture wars. The path means investing in our collective future, both in urban and rural areas, requiring better state funding for universities to increase access to higher education, and requiring public universities to do its part in increasing graduation rates of all students, lowering student debt, and preparing students with the skills and competencies to enter a global workforce upon graduation. And it requires investments in research and innovation that will help solve the grand challenges that we face: climate change, food insecurity, and clean energy, to name a few. Moving us toward this second path is a national priority and one of our major priorities at APLU. Now, you may not all be familiar with the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, so give me a moment to give you a little bit of background about the association. APLU is North America's oldest higher education association. We have about 250 members, just over 250 member universities, all public, top research and land-grant universities across Canada, the US, and Mexico. Of course, the University of Iowa is one of our members. Collectively, our institutions enroll 5.5 million undergraduate students, 2.2 million graduate students, which means just APLU institutions enroll about a third of all students in the United States. We also confer about half of all the degrees in the United States. And we're massive research institutions. Collectively, we conduct about $51 billion in annual research at public universities. This is the bulk of research that is being done at universities in the United States, be it public or private. In fact, it's actually more than most countries actually invest in research in its entirety. If APLU member institutions were a country, we'd actually be the 8th largest spender on research in the world, just under the UK and just above Taiwan. So for some perspective, well, I shouldn't say some perspective, but these stats and the fact that we represent such a large part of the college-age student body and the public universities' research role, it allows us back in Washington to be able to speak on public education and have some clout. It allows us to be able to advocate for public universities, for research, for many of the things I've outlined as what we will need to go down that path to strengthen our democracies. A huge role that we have is in advocacy. We advocate on behalf of public universities, such as the University of Iowa, to federal agencies, Congress, as well as to embassies and foreign governments based in Washington at the embassies. So our role is to communicate and help advocate on behalf of the public university to all of these key stakeholders. This past June, as Russ mentioned, I had the opportunity to testify before the Senate on this very topic of how do we internationalize our campuses and how do we change federal policies to make it easier for international students to get visas to come here and to stay and contribute to the economy after they graduate. This is a photo of me there at the dais doing my testimony. I like to think that I moved the needle somewhat with some senators on understanding the need for internationalization and how universities can play a pivotal role in this area. Now I'm going to conclude with an image. And it's an image you have seen, but you may not know much about this image or appreciate just how unique this image is. This is the very first photo, actually the only photo, ever taken of the Earth by a human being. And it's incredibly difficult to take this picture. You see, to capture this image, several things need to happen. First, you need thousands of years of knowledge transfer, innovation, scientific discoveries, resources, simply to build a spacecraft, develop a camera, and move a person into outer space to take this picture. Assuming you get to that level of technological advancement, in order to fully capture the full size of the Earth, you need some perspective. You need to be far enough away that you can capture the entire planet. Think of when you're on your iPhone and you're trying to take a picture of a building, you have to keep stepping back to get the entire building in frame. To be exact, you need to be about 20,000 miles away from Earth to be able to capture this photo. For some comparison, the International Space Station, which is where most astronauts go today, is only about 300 miles from Earth. And most satellites that we have in outer space orbit at around 1,000 to 3,000 miles from Earth. So this is quite a distance to take this picture. Essentially, you're only going to get this picture if you're on your way to the moon. Now, one last thing is needed in order for you to take this picture. You need to have the sun directly at your back so it can illuminate the planet in its entirety. Otherwise, you'll get a partial view of the Earth. Now, to date, there have only been 24 people that have ever traveled far enough to take this picture, and only 3 people that ever had just the right circumstances to see this view live, and only one of them actually took the photo. This year, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of this photo. It was taken on December 7th, 1972, by an astronaut on the Apollo 17 mission to the moon, which was the last mission to the moon that we had. And when you look at this photo of Earth, it's hard to believe that all of human history and experiences have taken place right here. Religions were founded, pyramids built, wars fought, empires built, empires lost, humans memorialized, demonized, enslaved, celebrated, all here on this one planet. And it's remarkable that this image, taken 50 years ago, is the first time we've ever had the perspective, both literally and figuratively, to see ourselves as a collective planet instead of a collection of people. And I hope that we continue to have this perspective moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bernie, thank you very, very much. We do have time for questions. Maybe I'll just go ahead and start if that's okay. So I have one question that kind of relates to the APLU, but it does sort of coincide with globalism and economic development. So I'm wondering what kind of relationship the APLU has with community colleges. And the reason why I ask that is because it seems to me that one of the stumbling blocks that we encounter in higher ed, and we're not even supposed to call it higher ed anymore, at least according to the AAU, they were here last week and said, don't use higher ed anymore because that doesn't market well, is that we don't have as many people going to college as we should. And that, that includes, public land grant, public universities and land grant institutions. It also would include community colleges. And as I look at higher ed just from our lens here, there are a couple of things going on. One is that nationally, I'm not sure that there have been, since the Obama administration, many efforts to increase attendance or the number of people enrolled in community colleges or institutions of higher education. We don't have as many people going to college as we should. Within our state, there's been a big emphasis on community colleges, especially as they relate to workforce development. And one can certainly make an argument for that. So I'm wondering if we want to, enhance economic development through globalization, make people more educated, make them more worldly, or at least knowledgeable. I mean, isn't there a role for enhanced educational efforts? I mean, you kind of alluded to that, but I'm wondering what we can concretely do, either in terms of policy or just even just on the level of discussion to make that happen. And would community colleges, and the roles that they play and the services that they provide be one way to start, especially for reaching populations that maybe have lost out to globalization and are not as privileged as maybe some other sectors of the economy or population are?
So I'm personally a big fan of community colleges. I mean, they have provided greater access to non-traditional students and Americans of all stripes to be a pathway into higher education or to develop the technical skills or pre-professional skills needed to enter the workforce. In Washington, we do work with AACC, the Association of American Community Colleges, which is kind of APLU's equivalent for community colleges in Washington. But we have to be careful with our advocacy on behalf of community colleges, and this is the reality of Washington, D.C. There can be some times where the view is, well, let's do free community colleges, and that funding may hurt public universities, because that funding has to come from somewhere at the state level. We would love it if all boats rose, but oftentimes we get pitted against one another in funding. So that's one thing we're always a little concerned about. We want to have both community colleges and public universities get increased funding, but that isn't always the way things work. So we always have to be somewhat careful with how much we advocate on behalf of community colleges in Washington. We let AACC do that part in themselves. That said, they have a key role with workforce development, but we oftentimes are not thinking about what the future workforce needs. And if you look at 2030, the National Bureau of Labor Statistics has predicted there's going to be about a 1.2 million shortfall in high-skilled jobs in especially healthcare, AI, advanced manufacturing, and these are jobs that require an advanced degree, which you have to get from a university. So we're trying to push on both ends. Yes, the need for more funding for community colleges, that makes sense for going into fields, but there's still a very strong need for support of public universities. And there's a role that only public universities can, well, universities, I should say in general, can play in terms of workforce development, what we're going to need in the economy in those high-skilled areas.
And then one follow-up in that regard, and this refers to some of the discussions we've had over the last couple of days. There are some models out there. I mean, I think that the state of New Mexico funds public education at the university level. But we also know that the state of Tennessee provides free community college for its citizens. Are there examples that we could, build up and build out to kind of meet these challenges that we're going to encounter in 2030 and beyond?
The answer I would hope is yes. The challenge is that each state makes its own policies and its own decisions on how it wants to spend its funding. Some states do a better job than others in terms of supporting education in general, let alone higher education. What we have found, especially during COVID, was as we were advocating for more funding for public universities to deal with COVID at the federal level, the federal government did a good job in sending funds to universities to help with that. While what we saw was that states were oftentimes willing to then just cut their contribution to the university. So federal funds, all that happened was the budget stayed the same and the state level dropped. So we always have this challenge that in Washington, yes, we can get more funding, but that may or may not actually benefit the public universities. And that's why it really needs to be done locally at the state level by your own state government relations teams here in Iowa or in Kentucky or in Tennessee. It's much more difficult for us to be able to impact that from Washington.
Right, that certainly makes sense. Peter, I'll hand the microphone to you.
So I have a question that sort of, follows that in a way. And I guess the easiest way to do this is to simplify a very complicated question, which is, while I agree with just about everything you said, I, as a parent of a 6- and 5-year-old, I'm having trouble squaring how I will possibly pay for my kids' education when they get to be that age. It already seems to me tuition and fees seems obscenely high. Mm-hmm. And if I'm somebody who is already angry and tired with my place in the global economy, I'm probably also somebody who is inclined to feel that higher ed, I hadn't heard that criticism, but it makes sense, that higher ed is elitist and therefore not a place I would even want to send my kids. And so it seems to me that there are a number of ways in which the argument that you're making is stacked up against a reality that is impossible for so many people. So how is it that a university or college education could be the answer if it is increasingly unavailable and inaccessible to so many people?
I love the question. Thank you. I think what we largely have, and this, I don't say this, this might come across the wrong way at first, so I'll try to back this up a bit more. In some degree, we have a perception problem. We have been viewed as elitist institutions, called elitist institutions. We sometimes embrace that term elitist institution, right? We're the flagship public university, or we're one of the top 10 public universities in this particular topic. It helps us, and there's benefit for us to hold ourselves up in a high light. And I'll probably have to take off my APLU hat for a second. I think it has done us a great disservice to go down that route of trying to be the Harvard of public universities or play that kind of game of rankings. I know we have to, but I think it has legitimately caused us to be viewed as elitist and out of touch. Where in reality, as I pointed out in this presentation, universities historically are the drivers of the middle class. We are the way people have gotten from being working class up into the middle class. And that's historic for the last 100 years that we've been those engines. And we know it's going to continue. The jobs that are going to pay the salaries that are going to get you that middle class lifestyle are still ones that oftentimes require a degree and an advanced background. So what I think universities need to do is we need to change the narrative and talk about how much we contribute to the society, to the local economy, how much we do in community engagement and workforce development. These pieces we don't always sell in the communities. We've talked about this for a while, and my current job kind of lets me interact between workforce development and community engagement. And the more we can do to show the value of education outside of the university in rural communities. Land grants, it's a little easier. They have extension. So they have a natural way of sort of showing the value that the university has on the local communities. And public universities will probably have to try a little bit harder to continue to do that same thing. But there are examples of this. Last night we had dinner with the Dean of Nursing, and they did a huge event across Iowa from the Missouri to the Mississippi with health clinics going around showing people the value, like what they expect to see in a motorcycle race that was going to be going across the state. The more we can do these things and show the value of public and impact of public universities in local communities, I think the easier it'll be for us to be seen as a place where you can go and get your education and move forward with your education and get a place in that middle class. But it's a challenge.
Push back a little bit and say, I do wonder though, like just the upfront costs and how that itself is a barrier.
Yeah.
I mean, the costs are actually increasing,
Yeah.
and wages are not following with those costs of higher education. And so I'm wondering how you even make the pitch to parents who are increasingly seeing themselves not even having the choice, even if they wanted to have it.
The cost of a public education is directly related to the investment by the state legislature, right? So you have some states that are going to have lower costs and some states that have higher costs, depending on how much the state legislator funds public education. If you're in a state where only 20% of your funding is coming from the state, you need to make the rest up in other ways. Tuition goes up, fees go up, costs go up. In states where they put more investment, you don't have that same thing. So I would love to see greater investment by state legislatures, because that's who funds public education. You do that, we're still not at the point that we were at in 2008. So we have seen a decrease in state contributions to public universities since 2008. Well, costs have only increased, right? We've had COVID responses, more costs that universities have had to be burdened with. It's a nuanced argument, which is very difficult to explain. But every time a state legislator decreases funding for education, you can expect the cost to go up. And that's the reality. So when we have an electorate that wants lower costs for education, well, that's what we should be voting for. That's what we should be pushing for. But it's a hard argument to make at times.
Frank has a question, so I will give the mic to him.
I think elitism's got a bad name, or at least it's got the wrong frame. And we're talking about. Sorry, shut this off. How can we have this conversation without talking about partisanship, political parties, and being deep in a culture war that we can't wish away? Mm-hmm. I mean, the people in the Iowa legislature who are cutting things are Republicans all over the country, and it's cutting taxes, cutting public structure, infrastructure, education. How can you address that in plainer terms?
The states that have been so red state, blue state, right? We have two different realities in public education in the United States. When I visit blue states, they have different issues, but maybe not as big of an issue as I've found in many red states. But I can look at Missouri as an example of a state that has kind of turned things around, where they've actually been getting greater commitments from funding from their state legislatures. And they've done quite a bit to really to take politics out of the value of universities to the community, right? Showing how the universities are leading to investments in the economy, into the state, but really selling it to the community. You have to get the electorate first. If you can get the electorate, you can get better policies put forth, but it's not an easy thing to do. Missouri has spent 10 years doing this and really trying to work with legislatures and getting community groups to also speak to legislatures on behalf of the benefits they see from the university. That has helped the system quite a bit in Missouri, but it doesn't work everywhere. And it's a challenge. I don't have a good answer for how to deal with that at a state level in a red state.
It would seem that instead of elitism, we could talk about achievement. That there's an equity or an equality as well that could replace that, because I'm fine with elitism as long as I'm the elite.
I think also showing what we can always show as public universities is couch things in terms of supporting the people of Iowa. And that can, we don't have to talk about, we can talk about DEI, but you can do DEI to support the people of Iowa, but framing it in you're supporting the people of Iowa. That might be a message that's easier to sell in a red state than you might find in a blue state.
Well, and even our messaging has, has coincided with that type of thinking. I mean, now we brand ourselves sort of co-equally as the University of Iowa and the University for Iowa. What kind of success that has had, we don't know, but it's certainly been part of our branding. I'll give the microphone to Claire and then Amy.
Thank you, Amy. So along these lines, I've been thinking about the fact that we often expect students who come into universities and colleges to start their internationalization trajectory as an 18-year-old. So what kind of obligation do we have to create those pipelines beyond flipping the narrative and beyond the publicity, that we need to do around the University for Iowa? How can we create pipelines to K-12 systems that are at great risk, not only in this state, but certainly in this state, which is, cutting funding left and right for programs in the arts and the foreign languages. And so this is kind of a piggyback on everyone's question, right? How can we get students earlier? How can we pipeline? How can we internationalize the state as the flagship?
So I won't have the perfect answer to that question. I don't know if one exists. But what I can say, what I've seen, is that community engagement piece can be so critical. And I didn't, unfortunately, get to meet with anyone in the Office of Community Engagement here at Iowa, but I've seen schools do this. For example, UNC Chapel Hill does, no, actually not, well, they may do it as well, but I'm actually thinking of Pitt. University of Pittsburgh does a huge outreach program where their international programs team goes out into the local high schools, and they work there in bringing international programming at the high school level, so that they're getting access to some of the diversity and some of the programs that the university offers, but also that the community in Pittsburgh already has. There's, just like here in Iowa City, there's different diasporas that they will bring together and do events, and they really engage the local high schools and elementary schools even on different aspects throughout the year on internationalization. So that outreach part is always critical. I think that's the first and foremost the best way to kind of hit two birds with one stone, I think. I also think we sometimes have a narrow view of internationalization. I'm not saying here at Iowa, but in general. And for some, that might just seem inaccessible. Study abroad is great. I went to study abroad. I think it's the best way to get a global experience. But it's not the only way, right? And some students will not have the ability to go abroad. They may not have the ability to study a foreign language, even though I think they should. I think everyone should study a foreign language. But they just might not. That might not be the reality. So what we can do is if we can provide what's called global learning, where we make sure students get access to global content and curriculum, in programming and in experiential learning. That could be through virtual internships with companies in other countries. That might be through, again, engagement with diaspora groups and volunteer opportunities, and also through collaborative online international learning systems, which allow you to be able to do a lot of what you get in study abroad, but do it virtually. So it's that access piece that I think will give more students the ability. And if students start in their first year who may never have thought about internationalization and going abroad, and they do an international internship, even be it virtual, their first year or second year, that might get them really interested and excited and then go abroad in their third year.
Thank you, Claire. Other questions?
I did want to make one last point on the cost, because I think it's a really good question. One issue we tend to fight quite a bit in Washington is we all get lumped together, public, private universities, tuitions. And oftentimes the numbers that come out of tuition of being $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year is much more reflective of, you know, the Harvards, Princetons, Grinnells here in Iowa. Whereas if you look at what the average debt is, if you're an in-state resident at a public university, tuition is about $10,000 a year. Not exactly cheap, but much more affordable, and very different from the narrative that you oftentimes hear about these $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year cost to education. And we don't always tell that story. I don't think the public always sees the difference between the public and the private.
I do have another question, if I could ask it. So, in terms of, you know, the haves and have-nots, those who have won out with or have benefited from globalization versus those who haven't, I was wondering if in your research and in your graphics, you talk a little bit about, or you could talk a little bit about the urban versus rural split, and whether or not that's a worldwide phenomenon, because you know, I'm not an expert in what goes on you know, in this field, but it seems to me that urbanization is increasing across the globe. In China alone, you know, over the last, say, 25 years, you've seen this mass movement from the countryside to the cities. I mean, almost 500,000 people, almost half of the population of China has moved from rural areas to urban areas. And globalization certainly has to be a part of that. It seems to me that the people left behind in the rural areas must feel pretty resentful. And it's not just in China, it's happening in India, it's happening in Africa, it's happening in North America. What does that urban-rural split, or what does that dynamic contribute to the type of resentment that leads to nationalism and the conflicts that you're talking about?
So it is a global phenomenon, right? I think the urban-rural divide is not unique to the United States. But what is somewhat unique to the United States is how we respond to that divide. Other countries put investments in rural areas. We're still trying to get broadband, right, across rural areas, you know, in 2022. So other countries can sometimes do a better job at making sure that there is a safety net that exists in those rural communities as well. So when those jobs might change or leave, there's some stability there still. We don't always do that in the U.S. Or places like Brazil, for example, or China. And it's a real issue. We've been advocating quite a bit at APLU. We always are pushing for rural investments at the same time that we're pushing for, you know, increases for public universities, especially since most of our land grants are in rural communities. And so we see this as you can't only invest in one area, right? You need it in both areas, and it does have dramatic political impacts. And there are things you can do, like we've looked at, you may have heard of the Heartland visa that is right now in Congress, which would be, there's a couple things that are going through, potentially through Congress, if anything happens in a lame duck session. But one would look at visas for international students to be able to get essentially a work visa to stay if they attend a university in a rural community and agree to work in that area in certain professions, in certain fields, to help build where we have lack of doctors, for example, or nurses or whatnot. So there are some pieces of legislation to look at how we can rebalance some of these inequities, but not but most have not passed, at this point at least.
Right, and I'm wondering, just on a related note, for, again, a brief follow-up, is that if we were able to slow down the rate of urbanization, would that help with climate change, for example, or are the two just not related?
I'm not a climate expert, but I have read some theories that actually greater urbanization is probably better for the environment, right? Because you actually use less, you don't drive as far, you have many more efficiencies in an urbanized area than you might in, let's say, a suburban area, which is probably the worst in terms of, especially if you're commuting long distances. So there could be an argument, but I'm not an expert on that topic, so I don't want to dive too deeply in it. But I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me.
Pardon me, other questions?
Were you afraid of those two guys who were sitting behind you when you were taking?
So what's funny is everyone thinks that those are henchmen. Let me see if I can get that picture back up. Someone actually asked me if Chris Christie was sitting behind me. These are actually both APLU employees. The one on to my right in the picture, to your left, is our Vice President for Government Affairs, Craig Lindworm. And the gentleman on the other side is McGregor Obelfell, who is one of our lobbyists that actually push for international and immigration issues in Washington. So those are actually colleagues of mine, but I loved it. It makes me look smaller, thinner. I thought it was great. Can't see my double chin quite as easily. I forgot, this is being recorded, isn't it?
That's okay. All right, very good. Well, listen, let's thank Freddie for
Thank you very much.